download our Revise It Right revision app for hundreds of videos, quizzes, exam questions, tutor support and so much more. This video is about blood. Blood is a tissue. Now you'll remember from our organisation video, so if you haven't watched it, please go and watch it, that a tissue is a group of similar cells working together. So what that means therefore is that blood must be a group of similar cells that are working together, and that's what makes it a tissue. So what we're going to do now is we're going to learn about those cells that you find in blood that work together to perform the function of carrying all the substances around the body. So first of all, we've got one of the blood cells, which is our red blood cells. Okay, so one cell that you find in our blood is red blood cells. Now the function of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen around the body. So it carries oxygen around the body. Now we can draw a red blood cell to sort of look like this, and this here to show its biconcave. So as well as needing to know the function, which is to carry oxygen around the body, you also need to know the adaptations of our red blood cell. Okay, so one adaptation is that they are biconcave shape. Okay, so you'll remember from looking at a diagram, maybe of a red blood cell, that they indent on both sides. There's a little indent on both sides, and that is what we call a biconcave shape. So concave is to indent, and bi obviously meaning two, meaning they indent on both sides. They're a biconcave shape, and the importance of this is to give them a larger surface area. Okay, and you'll remember from our video hopefully on diffusion that the larger the surface area, the quicker diffusion happens. Now, oxygen is going to move into and out of the red blood cells by diffusion, therefore it's going to do so quicker with a larger surface area. So larger surface area for quicker diffusion, and that's because they have a biconcave shape. Now they also contain a red pigment in them, which is what makes them red, called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin. Okay, this is also a second adaptation. They contain hemoglobin, and this is what the oxygen attaches to. So the oxygen attaches to the hemoglobin to be carried around the body to form something called oxyhemoglobin. So that's the function of hemoglobin, to the oxygen for attached to. And the third adaptation is that they contain no nucleus. Now why is that important? Well, if you think about it, if they don't have a nucleus, they can have more space for hemoglobin, so there can be more hemoglobin in the red blood cell. And if there's more hemoglobin, that means they can carry more oxygen around the body, therefore they're more efficient. They can carry more oxygen around the body in each go, in each circuit, so therefore they are more efficient. So there's the three adaptations of our red blood cells. Remember to download our Revise It Right revision app, watch over 700 videos, answer 4,000 plus quiz questions, over 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 exam questions, worksheets, forums, and get help from qualified teachers and so much more. The link is in the description. Now you've also got, and what you'll probably remember, is white blood cells, and there are different types of white blood cells, but we won't get into that in this video. But really the main function of the white blood cell is to defend against disease. Okay, so our function of our white blood cell is to defend against disease. Now these are also adaptation. The adaptations also within a white blood cell that make them good at their role. Okay, so one adaptation is that they can engulf pathogens. Now what a pathogen is essentially a microorganism that causes a disease. So it could be a bacteria that causes the disease, or a virus that causes disease, and they can engulf them. Okay, so that's one adaptation. Second adaptation is that they can produce something called antibodies. Now these are kind of like provide an organism with their immunity. And again, we will look at this in more detail in a future video. But for now, just be aware that they are adapted by being able to produce antibodies. And the third is they can also produce something called antitoxins. Now a toxin is something produced from a bacteria which causes harm. So they produce antitoxins which counteract the toxins produced. So again, making us feel better. So white blood cells are all about defending against disease, and that's the three ways they're adapted. They do have a nucleus, unlike the red blood cell. So also what you find in the blood is platelets. Okay, so I'm going to rub out our red blood cells so I can then start to talk to you about platelets. Okay, so we've learnt there about red blood cells, we've learnt about white blood cells. Now we're going to look at platelets. Okay, and what they are is they're small fragments of cells. So they're kind of like tiny bits of a cell, if you will. So small fragments of cells. And really their function is to help to clot a wound. So help to clot a wound. Now really that's obviously very important, because if you were to get a cut, some sort of a wound, two things could happen that would be bad. One, you could bleed out, lose too much blood and essentially die. Or secondly, microorganisms, pathogens that cause harm could also get into that cut, into that wound. So it needs to be clotted and closed off as quickly as possible. Okay, so platelets are there to help the blood to clot. Okay, so they're adapted by being rather sticky. Okay, that's obviously very important that they're sticky, so they can stick to each other, they can stick to the surface of your blood vessels to help clot the wound. If you were to have a lack of platelets, then it can cause excessive bleeding and bruising. Okay, so that is platelets. They're small fragments of cells that help to clot the wound. So plasma is the liquid that carries everything in the blood. Okay, now it's actually a sort of straw-coloured, yellowy-coloured liquid, so not the red that you would probably imagine it to be, and it carries everything in the blood. And now we say everything, we mean all those that we've just talked about there, so the red blood cell, the white blood cells, and the platelets. But also it carries much, much more than that. So for example, it carries carbon dioxide, it carries something called urea, it carries proteins, it carries the antibodies that are produced from the white blood cells and the antitoxins that are produced from the white blood cells. So there's lots of things here that plasma. So its function really is to carry everything in the blood, to transport it around, to carry it. And this is all the things that it carries. Many, many more, but this is enough that you need to learn. So all of the components, which are red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and obviously the plasma, and then extra, so carbon dioxide, urea, proteins, antibodies, and antitoxins. So there's a lot to take in there, as there always is, so have a go at really trying to summarise that information and answering these questions. Okay, so pause the video now. Okay, let's go through these questions then. Okay, so what is blood made up of? Well, it's a group of cells, and those cells are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and then obviously you've got plasma, which carries all of those around. So they are the four main components of blood. So if you were to get a question that asks you the components of blood, they would be the four: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Okay, name 5 things found in plasma. Well, we've looked at absolutely tons of them there. So you can say the red blood cells, the white blood cells, carbon dioxide, the platelets, hormones, proteins, antibodies, glucose, amino acids. So many things you can talk about. Any 5 of them is good. What is the job of the red blood cells? Well, it's to carry oxygen around the body. Okay, so notice in my question when I talked about name 5 things found in plasma, I didn't say oxygen, and that's because that is carried in the red blood cells. Now the red blood cells are carried in the plasma, but the oxygen isn't. Okay, so the job of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen around the body. What is the job of the haemoglobin? Well, that is what oxygen attaches to in the red blood cell to become oxyhemoglobin to be transported around the body. So 2 adaptations of red blood cell. Well, we learnt about 3, so any 2 from these. They're biconcave shape, which gives them a larger surface area. They contain haemoglobin, which attaches to the oxygen, and they do not have a nucleus, which means they can fit in more haemoglobin and then essentially more oxygen. How can white blood cells protect us against infection? Well, they do one of 3 things, you'll remember. They can engulf pathogens, they can release antibodies, or they can release antitoxins, and we will look at that in more detail in a future video. Question 8. What type of cell contains 0 chromosomes? Well, to do this, answer this question, you have to think a little bit. Where are chromosomes found? Well, they're found in the nucleus. And what cell have we just learned that doesn't contain a nucleus? Well, it's the red blood cell. Therefore, no chromosomes in the red blood cell. And finally, how do platelets form scabs? Okay, so they swarm to a wound and they're very sticky. They stick to the blood vessel and stick to each other to form a scab, to block, to clot the wound. So you have now learnt about the blood, each of the main 4 components that you find in blood: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets and plasma, and the adaptations of each. Again, you can now move to test your knowledge on the quiz and on exam questions, and you can also, if you're really struggling with any part of that, get into contact with one of our tutors and we will be happy to help.